Okay, starting a little early today. Testing one, two, three. Yeah, perhaps. All right, it's the 9th of October. Dis and Dat information. Andres Saenz de Sicilia's Subsumption, Chapter 3. Hopefully, we will get to the conclusion today. We will start at page 150 and get to do 15 plus pages. Well, actually more than that. 20 plus 20 pages. Alrighty then. Real subsumption. The objective positing of capitalist command. Whilst the formal subsumption of the labor process is significant in introducing capitalist relations into production, it does not yet, for Marx, signal a properly capitalist mode of production because the technical organization and objective means by which labor is carried out because the technical organization and objective means by which labor is carried out remain unchanged. What capital commands is a labor process structured around the requirements of an archaic mode of production. As such, and in spite of the potential increases in the scale and intensity of labor that subsumption under the command of a single capitalist affords, these labor processes come into contradiction with capital's unceasing drive to increase the production of surplus value. Most obviously, this contradiction takes the form of the social and natural limits to the working day which place constraints on the amount of surplus labor capitalists can effectively demand from a formally subsumed workforce. Following the establishment of capitalist social relations of production, and once the capitalist has command of the labor process, however, a second strategy of increasing surplus value becomes available. That is, the transformation of the material content and technical structure of the labor process in order to increase productivity. What Marx calls the real subsumption of labor under capital. Real subsumption involves the development of the social productive power of labor through the technical reorganization of the labor process, through the implementation of cooperation, divisions of labor, machinery and industrial technology, etc., in such a way that capital can overcome the barriers to accumulation present when it only formally subsumed when it is only formally subsumed the labor process. Let me stop for a moment, and I'm going to test the microphone yet again. Come on. Testing one, two, three. Seems okay to me. Alrighty. Well, anyway, the dynamic driving real subsumption must be understood as simultaneously operative across two levels of the social process, that is, individual capitals and total social capital. The technical transformations brought about with real subsumption are directly motivated by competition between individual capitals vying to accumulate surplus value. By introducing productivity-raising innovations which competitors do not possess and thereby lowering their production costs, an individual capitalist can, as Marx points out, benefit by either selling their commodities above their real value and reaping extraordinary profits, or simply reducing prices and outselling competitors, reducing the rate of turnover. Let me break for a second and note, yes, this is prices or have a role, and yes, this actually could have something have implications for antitrust. Anyway, nonetheless, although not centrally or socially planned, these innovations have a crucial aggregate effect once generalized amongst the majority of producers throughout society. They lower the value of the commodities needed for the reproduction of the workforce and, as a result, reduce wages. Footnote 142. In this way, the value component of the working day dedicated to necessary labor shrinks, rather than increasing the amount of surplus labor extorted from the worker by simply making the working day longer, as in formal subsumption. Capitalists are here able to take advantage of productivity increases to appropriate a greater portion of the value produced in the same duration of labor. This is why the real subsumption of the labor process brings about the possibility of relative surplus value production, i.e., increases in surplus value only relative to total value production rather than in absolute terms. In the face of natural and social limits, therefore, capitalists find another technique for ensuring constantly increasing accumulation, altering the material content of the labor process and the technical means and methods of working in a manner adequate to the demands of valorization. In doing so, the entire real form of production is altered and a specifically capitalist form of production comes into being at the technological level too. Footnote 143. Real subsumption and the production of relative surplus value that accompanies it consummate the dominance of capitalist relations within society's reproduction process. In consequence, not only does production take the form of a process actively directed towards the augmentation of value, but this goal comes to be inscribed in the concrete reality of its diverse particular moments and determines its means, methods, and development. The entire production process comes to be progressively determined by, as, and for capital. Marx conceptualizes three primary forms in which the transformations associated with real subsumption occur. Number one, cooperation. Number two, division of labor and manufacture. Number three, machinery and large-scale industry. Subsection 6.1, cooperation. Marx defines cooperation generally as the direct collective labor, unmediated by exchange, of many workers aimed at a shared goal, the production of the same use value. Footnote 144. It is the basic form of real subsumption and the general form upon which all social arrangements for increasing the productivity of labor are based. Footnote 145. Where the division of labor and machinery are introduced as successive forms, it is always as specifications of cooperation that rely on and presuppose it as their principal justice. All three of them presuppose the exchange relations brought about by formal subsumption. But cooperation is also treated by Marx as a specific form existing alongside manufacture and industry and conceptually distinct from them. Taken in this sense, Marx calls it the most rooted in nature, the crudest and the most abstract of its own varieties, presumably because versions of it can be found in almost every historical form of human society. Footnote 146. However, as a specific aspect of real subsumption, it has a more precise meaning. Although the concentration of many workers under one capital was already in place when the subsumption of the labor process was merely formal, those workers may, in many cases, have continued to undertake their labor individually and in separate locations, and therefore consume the same quantity of materials and means of labor as they would have done previously. Now, this changes with capitalist cooperation, where many individual workers are brought together in the same location by a capital and undertake their work simultaneously. This still in no way alters the technical structure and organization of the labor process itself, meaning that the difference is primarily purely quantitative. But it nonetheless offers the possibility of some subtle qualitative increases in productivity over and above a bare multiplication of the individual labor powers in addition to opening the way to further modifications of the labor process. Most obviously, many workers laboring in the same space will require a smaller outlay on constant capital than if they were working in separate locations, as they share resources like buildings, tools, and materials. As more laborers are employed to work cooperatively, individual differences in skill and strength tend to even out, meaning that the labor employed attains an average level of intensity. There are also potentially greater capacities unleashed by the many workers acting in unison. Marx uses the example of lifting a heavy weight, which the isolated worker is completely incapable of developing, footnote 147. Marx describes this as the initiation of a new productive power which is intrinsically a collective one, footnote 148. This collective power signals a heightened realization of human social being in the sense that when the worker cooperates in a planned way with others, he strips off the fetters of his individuality and develops the capability of his species, footnote 149. Such a heightened socialization of labor and its productive powers is something which, for Marx, is consistently developed by capitalist production as its most significant progressive consequence. But as something brought about under capitalist conditions, these capacities are confiscated from the workers and transposed into a productive power of capital. They are gifted to capital for nothing, as with the discoveries of science or the explorations of art, perhaps, given that the capitalist pays only for individual labor powers, not their potential collective productivity. Now, this gives rise to a phenomenological inversion that constitutes the most important effect of cooperation as a form of real subsumption, as Marx describes in his notebooks from 1861 to 1863. Quote, the capitalist buys not one, but many individual labor capacities at the same time, but he buys them all as isolated commodities, belonging to isolated mutually independent commodity owners. Once they enter into the labor process, they are already incorporated into capital, and their own cooperation is therefore not a relation into which they put themselves. It is the capitalist who puts them into it, nor is it a relation which belongs to them. Instead, they now belong to it, and the relation itself appears as a relation of capital to them. It is not their reciprocal association, but rather a unity which rules over them, and of which the vehicle and director is capital itself. Their own association in labor, cooperation, is in fact a power alien to them. It is the power of capital which confronts the isolated workers. Insofar as they are the relation to the capitalists as independent persons, as sellers, it is the relation of isolated, mutually independent workers who stand in a relation to the capitalists, but not to each other. They find that they are agglomerated. The cooperation which arises from this agglomeration is for them just as much an effect of capital as the agglomeration itself. Their interconnection and their unity lies not in themselves, but in capital, or the social productive power of their labor arising therefrom is a productive power of capital, just as the power of individual labor capacity not only to replace but to increase itself, that is, surplus labor, appears as a capacity of capital, so does the social character of labor and the productive power which arises from that character. Footnote 150, close quote. With formal subsumption, capitalist control of production was superimposed upon the labor process via ownership of its elements, making the presence of capital as an externally enforced, forced, mediation explicitly manifest. That is, The capitalists purchase the inputs and receive the final product bearing the unpaid labor of the workers. But once capital begins to act as the unifying force and subject of the composition of the labor process, its mediation of production becomes essential and indispensable to the internal aspect of that production. With real subsumption, capital is the relation that brings all of the elements of production together in a material as well as economic sense, brings about the concentration and articulation of many individual productive acts into a single coordinated process, and gives rise to augmented social productive powers. Because the social form of the cooperative labor process is formed quite independently of the individual laborers, it confronts them as a property of capital. And in this way, it really is, in a sense, capital that produces, whilst workers merely act as its organs, not merely at the level of ideas, but also in reality. The social character of his labor confronts the worker as something not merely alien, but hostile and antagonistic when it appears before him objectified and personified in capital. Footnote 151. As such, labor is not only functionally determined by capital as part of its circulatory life process, that is, formally, but it is now also subsumed in material terms in its concrete realization, that is, really. Marx argues that the twisting and inversion realized here on a material level takes on a form that is all the more real, the more, on the one hand, their labor power itself becomes so modified by these forms that it is powerless as an independent force, that is to say, outside this capitalist relationship, and that its independent capacity to produce is destroyed. Footnote 152. This modification, as we will see, is the essential tendency of real subsumption and acts as a band with which capital fetters the individual workers. This modification, as we will see, is the essential tendency of real subsumption, and it acts as a band with which capital fetters the individual workers, in the sense that, thanks to the innovations it introduces, capital gains a monopoly on productivity. As Roberts points out, and becomes hegemonic, that is, meaning that non-subsumed labor cannot be realized competitively, is unable to carry on independently, and will therefore perish unless it is incorporated into the capitalist production process. Footnote 153. Whilst the form of cooperation introduced by capitalists is merely simple, however, this hegemony and the concreteness of the inversion and dependency it introduces into production remains subtle. It is only once capital begins to truly recompose the labor process that its revolutionizing effects on production and in the subsumption of workers are truly felt. Six point two: division of labor and manufacture. It is the development of simple and distributive cooperation within a single production process that marks the transition to the division of labor in the system of manufacture for Marx. The division of labor in production develops the differentiation of social labor by dissecting the labor process into its constituent elements or partial operations that are then recombined within a single productive totality. The workshop unified under the command of the capitalist. This involves, on the one hand, a subdivision of the operations and subsumption under them of definite multiple numbers of workers, and on the other, their combination in one mechanism. In this way, manufacture seizes labor power by its roots. Instead of distinct tasks being carried out in succession by the same individual worker, as was the case even with simple cooperation, they are here distributed amongst a large group of workers, each of whom specializes in the realization of one particular function and therefore refines its efficiency. Footnote 154, the pin factory, right? This differentiation and integration of distinct activities is in turn reflected in the social division of labor in that it can precipitate the aggregation of multiple distinct handicrafts previously separated in the same workshop, producing a single commodity in such a manner that the realization of each particular craft and its tools are altered in light of the specific production process it forms part of. Alternatively, partial operations previously forming an organic unity with other actions within a particular craft can become isolated as the unique product of discrete capitals. Here, division and combination condition each other. Marx argues, as traditional processes are broken down and subsequently recomposed in forms more adequate to the end of valorization, what therefore took place on a political and economic level with so-called primitive accumulation has its parallel within the practical structure of the labor process itself. Footnote 155. The system of manufacture characterized by such a division of labor brings about a transformation in the temporal structure of the labor process. With its subdivision into partial operations, the activity of each laborer is materially decoupled from the production process of a commodity in its entirety, becoming instead an isolated moment of its realization. The complementarity of the different processes is here transferred from the future to the present, as the various operations are completed side by side rather than serially. Footnote 156. This synchronicity of different specialized functions increases the efficiency of the labor process hugely, and has the effect of further breaking down natural and practical limits to unceasing production, thus raising the productive power of the collective working organism to a far greater degree than simple cooperation was capable of. It is this heightened productivity that drives capitalists to implement and refine the division of labor in their workshops. Specialized workers, subsumed under their specific functions, develop in accordance with this system and perform their assigned operations with virtuosity. But for the workers themselves, this comes at the cost of monotony and dissociation from the final product of their labor, as the rhythm of their activity is no longer correlated with the full production process of a single product in its various stages and techniques, but is instead marked by the incessant repetition of particular minute tasks. This same tendency to specialization is expressed objectively in the means of labor. For example, in specialized tools designed for particular rather than general operations, general applications, whereas previously an individual worker would have possessed the knowledge, skills, and resources to see this process through to the completion of the final product. In the system of manufacture, individuals produce only a partial, one-sided aspect of the product and are thus reduced to personification of each isolated stage, which they perform monotonously. Quote, the independence becomes solidified, personified, when each simple and monosyllabic process of this kind becomes the exclusive function of a particular worker or a definite number of workers. They are subsumed under these isolated functions. This work is not divided among them. They are divided among the various processes, each of which becomes the exclusive life process of one of them, insofar as they function as productive labor capacity. The heightened productivity and complexity of the production process as a whole, its enrichment is therefore purchased at the cost of the reduction of labor capacity in each of its specific functions to nothing but a dry abstraction, a simple quality which appears in the eternal uniformity of an identical function, and for which the whole of the worker's productive capacity, the multiplicity of the capabilities, has been confiscated. Footnote 157, close quote. The actuality of capital's abstraction reaches a new degree here as the individual worker's life activity and identity as producer no longer even corresponds to a particular product, a product to whose objectivity they become increasingly indifferent, but simply to the repetitive completion of a single uncreative abstract function. Marx suggests that this constant labor of one uniform kind disturbs the intensity and flow of a man's vital forces, which find recreation and delight in the change of activity itself, and that it converts the worker into a crippled monstrosity by furthering his particular skill through the suppression of a whole world of productive drives and inclinations. Footnote 158. With the division of labor in capitalist production, the reality of human practices thus takes on an increasingly abstract, simple, and generic quality. In every craft it seizes, manufacture creates a class of so-called unskilled laborers. Footnote 159. Both the organic unity and anticipatory organization of the series of actions that constitute the entire process of producing a single discrete commodity fall increasingly to the side of capital. Knowledge, judgment, and will are faculties now required only for the workshop as a whole. Footnote 160. Quote, for the worker himself, no combination of activities takes place. The combination is rather a combination of the one-sided functions under which every worker or number of workers is subsumed group by group. His function is one-sided, abstract, partial. The totality which is formed from this is based entirely on his merely partial existence and isolation in his separate function. It is therefore a combination of which he forms a part, but it depends on the fact that his labor is not combined. Footnote 161. This has the effect of strengthening and intensifying the real subsumption of labor initiated with simple cooperation, where capitalist relations of production constituted a merely temporary connection between the elements of production, a contiguity which, by the nature of things, may easily be dissolved. In that case, the domination of capital had not yet cemented itself as an indispensable technical mediation, but rather emanated from the will and economic authority of the capitalist. With the system of manufacture, it begins to do so because of the way in which workers are individually subsumed in their functions and connected to other workers only as appendages to the workshop, as fragments of the whole that cease to function outside of it. This intensifies the conditions under which the worker is isolated and dependent on their subsumption under capital. Quote, originally, he had to sell to the capitalist instead of the commodity, the labor that produced the commodity, because he was not in possession of the objective conditions for the realization of his labor capacity. Now, he has to sell it because his labor capacity only continues to be labor capacity insofar as it is sold to capital. Thus, he is now subsumed under capitalist production, has now fallen under the control of capital, no longer just because he lacks the means of labor, but because of his very labor capacity, that is, the manner and nature of his labor. Now capital has in its hands no longer just the objective conditions, but the social conditions of the subjective labor, the conditions under which his labor continues to be labor at all. Close quote, footnote 162. Thus, even though the workers form the building blocks of the combined workshop, it's not subsumed under them as a united group. Footnote 163. Capital has been autonomized as the unifying principle of the overall production process, which confronts the workers in an external power, dominating and enveloping them. In fact, as the power of capital itself and a form of its existence, under which they are individually subsumed, and to which their social relation of production belongs. This inversion intensifies the degree to which real subsumption strips off the form of production for subsistence and becomes production for trade, the only barrier to which, given its indifference to individual needs, is the magnitude of the capital itself. Footnote 165. Here, the minimum level of capital needed to form a competitive enterprise begins to rise as the technical complexity of the single productive entity increases, further dwarfing the productive significance of the individual worker. Footnote 166. In this way, manufacture is the first system to provide the materials and the impetus for industrial pathology. Although this pathology is only realized once the despotism of capitalist command begins to develop the objective means peculiar and adequate to the accumulation process of capital, that is, machinery. Footnote 167, section 6, subsection 6.3 of chapter 3, machinery and large-scale industry, the material inversion, separation and integration characteristic of real subsumption, which proceeds on the basis of the social relations introduced with labor's formal subsumption and develops through the stages of cooperation and manufacture, achieve their apotheosis in large-scale industry based on machinery. The technical form of production most adequate to the valorization of capital. Quote, the increase of the productive force of labor and the greatest possible negation of necessary labor is the necessary tendency of capital, as we have seen. The transformation of the means of labor into machinery is a realization of this tendency, close quote, footnote 168. What distinguishes the stage of large-scale industry is the complete revolution it brings about in the instrument of labor, in the practical object that mediates the metabolic transformation of nature from tools, which are shared by both simple cooperation and manufacture, undergoing only minor modifications in the latter, to machinery. Once adopted into the production process of capital, the means of labor passes through different metamorphoses, whose culmination is the machine, or rather an automatic system of machinery, footnote 169. Machinery is not simply a larger or more complex tool, which would still require its operation to originate in a human source, but a self-moving mechanism which can perform its functions free of the limits of the human frame. For example, the maximum number of implements operable or the maximum speed of working. It is the machine which possesses skill and strength in place of the worker, is itself the virtuoso. Footnote 170. The entire technical paradigm of human civilization accrued over millennia and culminating in the system of manufacture, the human as a tool-making animal, is thereby superseded with machine production, which no longer seeks to refine a labor process based on human physical capacities, but rather harnesses vast forces of nature in order to function with a degree of power and scale inaccessible even through the coordinated cooperation of huge numbers of human laborers. In machinery, this is achieved by developing the principle of a rational division of labor designed to maximize the efficiency of the production process, that same principle underlying manufacture, but in a manner that surpasses the barriers set by its foundation in coordinated human labor. Quote, here we have again the cooperation by division of labor, which is peculiar to manufacture, but now it appears as a combination of machines with specific functions. In manufacture, it is the workers who, either singly or in groups, must carry on each particular process with their manual implements. The worker has been appropriated by the process, but the process had previously to be adapted to the worker. This subjective principle of the division of labor no longer exists in production by machinery. Here, the total process is examined objectively, viewed in and for itself, and analyzed into its constitutive phases. Footnote 171. The scientific analysis of the labor process, close quote. The scientific analysis of the labor process that accompanies industrial production is thereby liberated from an anthropological schema of labor, objectifying in the means of production an entirely new rhythm and motion founded on the life process of capital rather than on the worker. Footnote 172. It transforms the workshop into the factory, an automaton consisting of numerous mechanical and intellectual organs, an articulated system of processes and machines whose regulating principle is an ever perfected continuity of production, a drive to eliminate all interruptions to the labor process. Footnote 173. Yet this refinement of productivity is not done for intrinsically technical ends or to maximize the production of use values for the sake of their consumption, but only to intensify the objectification and appropriation of labor and nature by capital. Quote, Like every other instrument for increasing the productivity of labor, machinery is intended to cheapen commodities and, by shortening the part of the working day in which the worker works for himself, to lengthen the other part, the part that he gives to the capitalist for nothing. The machine is a means for producing surplus value. Close quote, footnote 174. Whilst reducing necessary labor time to an absolute minimum, machinery at the same time creates new means and incentives to extend the working day as far as possible, pushing absolute surplus value production to its uttermost limit. Large-scale industry drives production away from natural or human rhythms and toward the unceasing homogeneous continuum of the time of accumulation. With its introduction at the end of the 18th century, excuse me, Marx notes, every boundary set by morality in nature, age and sex, day and night was broken down. Footnote 175. This occurs primarily by a further intensification of the abstraction and simplification of human labor introduced with manufacture. However, in this case, this does not proceed by way of technical specialization, as it does in manufacture, but rather by its opposite, a generic specialization in passivity based on completely simple labor, characterized by uniformity, emptiness, and subordination to the machine. Footnote 176. Large-scale industry robs the labor of its singularity, reducing it to its most average, undifferentiated, and replaceable quality, to the extent that it precipitates the mass employment of women and children through its abolition of skill and dexterity from the labor process. Footnote 177. Here, the last remnant of the worker's satisfaction in his own labor disappears to be replaced by absolute indifference, which is itself conditioned by the labor's lack of real content. Footnote 178. Because machinery does not require direct operation but functions automatically, requiring only supplementary assistance, the activity of the workforce but functions automatically, requiring only supplementary assistance, the activity of the workforce becomes determined and regulated on all sides by the movement of the machinery and not the opposite. Footnote 179. The worker is displaced from the center of the labor process to its margins by the system of machinery, cast merely as its conscious linkages, overseeing its operation as watchman and regulator rather than chief actor. Footnote 180. By the same token, the principle of capitalist command, which seeks to pump out the maximum quantity of effort from labor power in every moment of its use, not only emanates from the subjective relations between capitalist and worker, but becomes objectively imprinted into the technical structure of the means of production. And this, hence, from a value point of view, this is Kleiman, right? Kleiman and McGlone argue, quote, with machinery, it's no longer just competition in the market, the threat of unemployment, and the watchful eye of the foreman that force workers to produce according to socially necessary labor time. Rather, the production process is designed such that the worker's activity must keep pace with the unyielding pace of the machine. Footnote 181, close quote. Even without extending the working day, machinery can increase the productivity of labor by dictating the pace of work, resulting in a condensation of labor time, in which every part of the time increases its labor content, and through which the pores, P-O-R-E-S, the pores of time are, so to speak, shrunk through the compression of labor. Footnote 182. All this occurs not simply in the neutral drive to increase material productivity, but bearing all the contradictions that the exploitation of labor by capital generates and raising them to their highest degree. Whereas with formal subsumption, the conditions of labor produce for the workers an alien circumstance. With the full realization of real subsumption under the factory system, this antithesis or alienation develops further into an antagonistic contradiction. Footnote 183. The means of production themselves stand over living labor as an oppressive force, animated by the drive to reduce to a minimum the resistance offered by man, that obstinate yet elastic barrier. Footnote 184. All of the productive powers embodied by machinery, as well as the system of scientific knowledge that is its basis, while serving to reduce necessary labor to a minimum, suffer a dialectical inversion with real subsumption, such that both in practice and in their forms of appearance, they confront the worker as weapons serving only to raise their exploitation and domination to the highest possible degree. Quote, here too, past labor in the automaton and the machinery moved by it steps forth as acting apparently in independence of living labor. It subordinates labor instead of being subordinate to it. It is the iron man confronting the man of flesh and blood. The subsumption of his labor under capital, the absorption of his labor by capital, which lies in the nature of capitalist production, appears here as a technological fact. The keystone of the arch is complete. Dead labor has been endowed with movement, and living labor only continues to be present as one of dead labor's conscious organs. The living connection of the whole workshop no longer lies here in cooperation. Instead, the system of machinery forms a unity set in motion by the prime motor and comprising the whole workshop, to which the living workshop is subordinated insofar as it consists of workers. Their unity has thus taken on a form which is tangibly autonomous and independent of them. Footnote 185. Large-scale industry thus, close quote, large-scale industry thus represents the culminating form of capital's social autonomization and domination. It's no longer the individual producer subjects who consciously regulate their metabolism with nature, but the machine, whose scientific conception already guarantees the carrying out of labor on a capitalistic basis. The human is no longer the subject of production, the one who consciously gives form to the product, but has become the implement of capital's own anticipatory conceptualization. Footnote 186. This conceptualization becomes a specific area within the social division of labor as science, design, and technological innovation. Where it does persist within a single enterprise, it is nonetheless separated off from the direct labor involved in the production of concrete commodities as the distinct activity of, yes, research and development. Footnote 187. Through the enormous development of scientific powers underlying industrial production, workers become increasingly dispensable and replaceable. Although, of course, industry also produces a hierarchy of workers and creates a class of technically skilled workers as their capacity to labor and to resist is increasingly delimited by the preset modes of operation built into the system of machinery. If you learn the software, etc. It was in this sense that Marx suggested that it would be possible to write a whole history of the inventions made since 1830 for the sole purpose of providing capital with weapons against working class result. Footnote 188. Castillo Mendoza emphasizes this, arguing that with machinery, technique operates as an artifact of power subsumed as a mediation of the political in the factory, constituted in the structure most suitable to impose vigilance and discipline and to neutralize the control of workers over work. In it, the workers now have a social relation of production amongst themselves and with the capitalist in the organic interior of capital. Footnote 189. Let me stop here for a moment. I'll be back. Subsection 7. We're still in chapter 3. We're coming to the end. Through its subsumption of labor, capital radically remolds all its social and technological conditions, dissolving and recomposing relations, practices, and instruments in order to meet the demands of competitive valorization and ultimately expanded reproduction. Footnote 190. The exposition of the formal, hybrid, and real modes of this subsumption charts the various strategies through which the capital relation and the class domination that it sustains attain a more concrete existence, a more effective subordination of labor, and a deeper penetration into the material structure of the social reproduction process as a whole. First appearing as an external and arbitrary mediation imposed upon producers from outside at the level of exchange, capitalist power subsequently develops into a technological fact built into the labor process as its material presupposition, thereby displacing and diversifying the sources of class antagonism beyond the surface level of intersubjective, albeit impersonal, i.e., economic, social relations. However, the distinction between these forms of subsumption is neither an empirical typology nor a historical periodization of different forms of capitalist production, but rather a conceptual differentiation of the modes in which the exploitation and domination of labor's productive activity by capital can be structured and developed, as well as the material and social effects that result from these modes. Footnote 191. Now, we've seen how, from its most subtle formal incarnation right up to its most developed real form, capitalist subsumption functions through a dual figuration or form determination. Firstly, there is the specific conjunction of accumulated historical acts, monetary and commodity forms, and the permanence of an entire legal economic apparatus governing the circulatory patterns in which wealth moves across society in the course of its reproduction. Together, these factors constitute the system of economic representation within which discrete social elements are inscribed as alienable and commensurable property through their commodification and subsumption under the forms of values. A lot there. Secondly, there is a specific form-determination of production, both in terms of the social relations which govern it, that is, capitalist command and direction of coordinated labor, and the objective technical structure of labor process itself, from cooperation to machinery. These two latter factors combined institute a dimension of direct subordination in the quote-unquote hidden abode of production through which the realization of labor is consciously regulated and refined as a means to valorize capital. The relation of capitalist subsumption is therefore constituted through the combination of two series of form-determining mechanisms that establish the presence and action of human labor on two distinct but interconnected levels of social actuality, that of value, that is being, and that of capital, process. The two moments of figuration occurring in exchange and production mutually presuppose each other as the basic conditions of the subsumption, and crucially, whilst both are necessary, neither is sufficient for subsumption without the other. Hybrid forms in which capitalist control of production is indirect and supported by contextual socioeconomic factors notwithstanding. This is something Diane Elson has argued with reference to Marxist value theory. Quote, the process of exploitation is actually a unity, and the money relations and labor process relations, which are experienced as two Discretely distinct kinds of relation are, in fact, one-sided reflections of particular aspects of this unity. Neither money relations nor labor process relations in themselves constitute capitalist exploitation. And neither one can be changed very much without accompanying changes in the other. Footnote 192, close quote. The unity of the two sets of relations binds together the logical discourse of values, formal metamorphoses in circulation, M-C-M prime, with the materialist discourse, this is logical discourse and material discourse of metabolic synthesis in production to constitute the realization and expansion of capitalist exploitation. Footnote 193. In the first instance, commodification and wage relations are necessary for labor's formal alienation as labor power, that is, the act which forms the basis for the transformation of money into capital and the possibility of surplus value, and incorporation into capital as variable capital, property of the capitalist. As Marx states, quote, without the exchange of variable capital for labor power, the total capital could not valorize itself, and so the formation of capital and the transformation of the means of production and means of subsistence could not take place. Footnote 194. This first circulatory form determination, this first circulatory form determination in the unity of its moments is an inescapable condition for capital, a condition posited by its own nature, since circulation is the passing of capital through the various conceptually determined moments of its necessary metamorphosis, that is, its life process. Footnote 195. The production process is, however, equally necessary for purchased labor power to valorize capital by objectifying commodity product. That is, once under the command of the capitalist, variable capital is used up in order to generate the surplus, which can then be accumulated. It's only through this process that variable capital, that is labor, right? Labor as variable capital, acts as capital, which is to say, is functionally determined as a moment of its valorization process, subsumed under it. Because of the privileged function assigned to the exploitation of labor within the capitalist economy as the sole source of surplus value, the productive capacity of the labor process is of paramount concern for individual capitals in their competitive development. Therefore, even though from the standpoint of circulation, the production process becomes, therefore, even though from the standpoint of circulation, the production process appears simply as an unavoidable middle term, a necessary evil for the purpose of money making, the material configuration of the production process becomes one of the most intensive sites in which the effects of capitalist domination manifest themselves. Footnote 196. It is precisely here that we find the second moment of material, as opposed to logical, form determination. Now, these two phases of figuration are therefore intertwined as the constitutive poles of capitalist production as a whole, i.e., the total process, Gesamtprozess of expanded, that is, the total process of expanded reproduction implicit in the capitalist social relation, each one acting as the necessary mediation of the other. In addition, or rather as a result, they constitute the two levels of form determination which are bound together and reproduced as the basis of capitalist power, that is, commodification and alienation in circulation. and subjection and exploitation in production. It's all there. These are the two basic aspects of capitalist domination and the two modalities of form determination, both equally essential to its functioning. Capitalist subsumption must therefore be grasped comprehensively as a process that unfolds across both the sphere of economic objectivity, that is, market relations, and the sphere of practical objectivity, which is production relations, and tied together by a single unified relation of reproduction. The internal correlation of the two series, which structures and regulates the social process as it unfolds in practice, is the basis for the ongoing division and composition of the social totality, the distribution of resources and labor power across various branches of production, and with the increasing socialization of labor, of the integration of reproductive practices within a single world market. It is vital to note, however, that there is no inherent unity between commodity exchange and labor outside of their historically specific capitalist articulation. Footnote 197. For Marx, the labor process as such has nothing to do with the act of purchasing the labor capacity on the part of the capitalist, whilst at the same time, the concept of the commodity in and for itself excludes labor as process. Footnote 198. Yet the two moments presuppose one another insofar as, taken together, they form the life process of capital, which involves the constant movement of values between production and circulation. See, volume 2. Between the positing of surplus value in the former, that is in production, and its realization in the latter, that is circulation. They are not simply bound together in mutual indifference, but constantly run into one another and interpenetrate, and in this way, their distinguishing features are continuously blurred. Footnote 199. The unity of these two moments of subsumption, that is corresponding to exchange and production, or production and exchange, that is the unity of these two moments, that is subsumption of labor to the commodity and value, and subsumption of labor to capital and the valorization process, therefore constitutes the distinctive synthesis of the capitalist social relation and the articulation through which the labor process is determined practically as for capital, as a moment of capital's own being, which precedes within its substance and forms its content. Footnote 200. Crucially, the tendency of capitalist subsumption, instituted materially with labor's real subsumption, is to guarantee the reciprocity of exchange and production through a progressive adequation and adaptation of the two moments, such that each becomes increasingly inherent and integral to the other's functioning, reinforcing their overall unity. So in that sense, it's an intersection, right? Rather than, it's a union rather than an intersection, let's put it that way. Capitalist production intensifies commodification, and capitalist circulation drives the development of subsumption in production. Hence, that's why it becomes circular, right? Or that's why it circulates, yes? The initial indifference of commodity exchange on the labor process is thus progressively negated as their unity within the capitalist social relations becomes a social and material fact imprinted in their inner structure. There's a lot there. But even within the terms of the articulation specified by this distinctive synthesis, the correlation of the two spheres is not fixed, but in a perpetual process of contestation and transformation. This transformative dynamic is immanent to the logic of subsumption itself, which, even with its culmination in real subsumption, does not mark the completion of a transition, but rather installs a program of complete and constantly repeated revolution in the social and material conditions of the reproduction process. There's a lot there, right? But it is a way of talking about, how subsumption is a means by which this sort of happens. Yes, it's a way of describing it. In this sense, the relation between the forms of subsumption cannot be contained within the reductive framework of an evolutionary internalist conception of necessary stages experienced by each and every individual capital, a framework which gives rise to an impoverished scheme of more or less developed capitals, national economics, and regions. So in that sense, we're trying to transcend that, whether it means, globally or whatever. Rather, the way in which the process of subsumption unfolds across the spheres of production and circulation constitutes a fluid dynamic. Hence, all the sort of the current version, right? The fluid dynamic within which the distinct forms can be contemporaneous moments. So, all that arm waving about material science and chemistry actually sort of works. A fluid dynamic capable of realizing itself on a social scale with radically diverse local results. Whilst Marx's analysis of the forms of subsumption is limited to the terms of a single production process, in spite of the constitutive character of exchange relations, it is clear that the conditions of subsumption in production, and indeed of their unity with capital's circulatory conditions, presuppose the unity in indifference, unity dash in dash indifference of multiple competing capitals. This presents the necessity of thinking subsumption on a social scale, that is, at the level of these multiple and diverse processes of production and circulation, all of which have their unity within the reproductive framework of society as a total structure in process. This throws up new problems regarding the conceptualization of capitalist subsumption, new forms and contradictions emerging from the conflict between capital and labor conceived globally, and inscribes the theory of subsumption within the critical context of an open process of historical development. And that gets us to the end. We've completed chapter 3 of Andres de Sicilia's text, Subsumption, chapter 3 by Andres Saenz de Sicilia, his Subsumption in Kant, Hegel, and Marx, from the Critique of Reason to the Critique of Society, and noting, of course, that we've gone through Kant, we've looked at Hegel, then we've gone to where Hegel is important for Marx and not for itself, and to begin to see how it's integrated into the Marxian text of Capital. And we've seen it cover all kinds of stuff, from the simplification of Volume 1 to some of, as we've just looked at, a kind of Volume 2, a visit to Volume 2 in terms of circulation and production, the two departments, as it were. And so on Monday, we will look at the dynamic, or well, maybe tomorrow. We may start chapter 4 tomorrow, the dynamic of subsumption on a social scale, which deals with historicity and closure. And we get to, more recent relative to, sort of theoretical elements. That is Antonio Negri on total subsumption, and Theodore Adorno on subsumption as total administration, and some other elements here that I think are important to talk about, not simply what we sort of have looked at now as a, not so static, but sort of proto dynamic, pre-dynamic kind of modality. And note that chapter 4 is the final chapter, which you will all be glad that I probably have finished with relative speed. So we will begin chapter 4 tomorrow on Friday, I think. But we may have an intervention of one kind or another for time reasons, whatever. So at the current moment, I will stop the live stream